The basket of carrots hit the stone path and rolled in every direction, and Mira froze in horror as one bounced straight off the boot of the man standing in front of her. She had not seen him. She had been rushing, as she always did, her arms full and her mind somewhere else entirely, and now she had thrown half the palace garden's morning harvest at a stranger's feet. Her heart slammed against her ribs. In this kingdom, hitting the wrong person with anything, even a vegetable, could end badly. Alphas did not forgive clumsiness easily, and this man was built like a wall, wide shoulders, a thick chest, a presence that seemed to fill the narrow garden path completely. "I am so sorry," she said quickly, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered carrots. Her hands shook. "I did not see you there. Please, I did not mean any disrespect." The man did not answer right away. Mira kept her eyes down, scooping carrots into the basket, praying he would simply walk away. Instead, she heard him crouch down beside her. A large hand reached out and picked up one of the carrots that had rolled the farthest, and instead of tossing it aside or demanding an apology fit for royalty, he studied it for a moment, as if it were the most interesting object he had encountered all week. "You grew these yourself?" he asked. Mira blinked up at him. His voice was deep but not unkind, and there was something almost boyish in the way he turned the carrot over in his fingers. He had a round, friendly face, cheeks that had a little softness to them, and eyes that crinkled at the corners like he smiled often. He did not look like the guards who patrolled the outer wall, all hard edges and short tempers. He looked like someone who enjoyed a good meal and a good laugh. "Yes," she said carefully. "I work in the royal garden. These were meant for the kitchen." "They look better than what usually ends up on my plate," he said, and before she could stop him, he took a bite. Mira's mouth fell open. Nobody ate raw garden carrots straight from the dirt path, not when there were kitchens full of trained cooks a short walk away. But the man chewed with an expression of genuine pleasure, as though she had handed him a delicacy instead of a slightly bruised vegetable that had just been thrown at his boot. "That is remarkable," he said, and reached for another. "You do not have to do that," Mira said, half laughing despite her nerves. "I already apologized. You do not need to eat the evidence." "I am not eating it out of politeness," he said, his mouth full. "I am eating it because it is good, sweet, not overgrown and woody like the ones from the eastern fields." He picked up a third carrot, examined it, then ate that one too. Mira stared at him, unsure whether to be charmed or worried. 3 carrots in less than a minute was an unusual amount of enthusiasm for a man she did not know, especially for someone who was already, she noticed now, quite solidly built beneath his plain brown coat, not thin by any measure. If anything, he had the comfortable heaviness of someone who never turned down a second helping, and judging by how quickly the carrots were disappearing, he was not about to start now. "You are going to spoil your appetite for whatever meal is waiting for you," she said before she could stop herself. She often spoke before thinking, and it had gotten her in trouble more times than she could count, but something about this stranger made her forget to be careful. He laughed, a full, warm sound that seemed to surprise even him. "I do not think that has ever happened to me in my life." "Well, there is a first time for everything." She finally managed to gather the last of the scattered carrots and stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. Up close, she realized just how tall he was, though his broad frame made him seem more solid than towering. "I really am sorry for hitting you. I was not paying attention." "Do not apologize again," he said, standing as well, brushing his hands off on his coat. "It is the most interesting thing that has happened to me all day, possibly all week." Mira frowned slightly, curious despite herself. "That sounds like a very dull week." "You have no idea," he muttered, and something flickered behind his eyes, a tiredness that did not match the easy warmth of his smile. He looked, for just a moment, like a man carrying something heavy that he did not want to talk about. Then the look was gone, replaced by that same friendly grin. "What is your name, garden girl?" "Mira," she said. "And you are?" He hesitated, just slightly, a pause so brief she almost missed it. "Barros," he said. "Well, Barros, I need to get these to the kitchen before the cook notices I am late." Again, she hoisted the basket onto her hip. "It was nice meeting you. Try not to eat any more raw vegetables off the ground. It is not very dignified." "Dignity is overrated," he said, and there was real amusement in his voice now. "Will you be here tomorrow?" The question caught her off guard. Nobody asked to see her again. She was the Omega who tripped over her own feet in the dining hall, who dropped trays and knocked over flower pots, and had once, memorably, walked directly into a closed door in front of half the kitchen staff. People tolerated her because she worked hard and never complained, but they did not seek her out. "I am here every morning," she said slowly. "Tending the garden is my job." "Then I will see you tomorrow," Barros said, and there was something in the way he said it, simple and certain, that made her stomach do a strange little flip she chose to ignore. She hurried off toward the kitchen entrance, and it was not until she was halfway down the corridor, her arms aching from the basket, that she realized she had never seen him before in her life, and yet he had walked the garden path as though he owned it. She did not think much more of it. The kingdom was full of nobles and guards and merchants who passed through the palace grounds, and she had learned long ago not to waste energy wondering about faces she would likely never see again. She delivered the carrots to the kitchen, endured a brief scolding from the head cook for being 3 minutes late, and spent the rest of her morning weeding the herb beds, humming quietly to herself the way she always did when she wanted to keep her mind from wandering toward thoughts that made her sad. Mira had come to the palace 2 years ago, sent by her family in the hope that steady work and royal wages might improve their fortunes. She had grown up in a small farming village 3 days' ride from the capital, one of 5 children, the only Omega among 4 alphas who had all found mates, and left home by the time she turned 19. She had not found anyone. She was told, gently at first and then less gently, that her clumsiness made her difficult to court, that no one wanted a mate who could not walk across a room without knocking something over. She had accepted this the way she accepted most disappointing things in her life, quietly, without much fuss, and had thrown herself into garden work instead, finding a strange peace in the dirt and the growing things that did not judge her for her missteps. The following morning, she arrived at the garden earlier than usual, though she told herself it had nothing to do with the stranger from the day before. She knelt in the soil, checking on the new rows of beans she had planted the previous week, and had just started humming her usual tune when a shadow fell across her. "You were not lying," Barros said. "You really are here every morning." Mira looked up, startled, and felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the sight of him. He wore a different coat today, a deep green one that looked expensive, though it strained slightly across his broad shoulders and stomach. He was carrying something wrapped in cloth, and when he unwrapped it, she saw a small pastry, still warm, clearly taken from the palace kitchens. "I brought you this," he said, holding it out, "as an apology for eating your carrots yesterday." "You do not need to apologize for eating carrots that I threw at you," she said, though she took the pastry anyway, unable to hide her smile. "This is very kind, but unnecessary." "I wanted to." He settled himself on the low garden wall nearby, which groaned slightly under his weight, though he did not seem to notice or care. "Besides, I have been thinking about them all night. The carrots, I mean. They were better than anything the palace cooks make." "That seems unlikely. The royal kitchen is famous throughout the kingdom." "Famous does not always mean good," he said, and there was that flicker again, the tired shadow behind his easy smile. "Sometimes, the food that is supposed to impress everyone tastes like nothing at all." Mira studied him for a moment, unsure what to make of this strange, cheerful, oddly sad man who seemed to appear out of nowhere and speak in riddles about carrots and dignity and famous food that tasted like nothing. She decided, in the end, that it did not matter. He was pleasant company, and pleasant company was rare enough in her life that she was not about to question it too closely. "Well, if you want good food, you should try the herb bread the kitchen staff make for themselves," she said, going back to her weeding. "It is nothing fancy, just simple bread with rosemary and a bit of salt, but it is the best thing I have eaten since I arrived here." "I would like to try that," Barros said, and he sounded so genuinely interested that Mira found herself smiling again. They talked for nearly an hour that morning, about nothing important, about the weather and the garden and the strange habits of the palace peacocks that wandered the grounds and screamed at odd hours of the night. Barros asked question after question, about her village, her family, her work, and he listened to her answers with a focus that surprised her. Most people, when she spoke, seemed to be waiting for their turn to talk, or simply not listening at all. Barros leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and actually seemed to care about the answers. In turn, she learned very little about him. He deflected questions about his own life with jokes, or by changing the subject entirely, always steering the conversation back toward her, or toward food, or toward some observation about the garden that made her laugh. She noticed, too, that he ate almost constantly during their conversations. Not in an unpleasant way, but steadily, as though eating gave him comfort, or distraction, or both. He finished the pastry he had brought her when she was too polite to take more than one bite, then picked at the edges of a second one he produced from his coat pocket, then eventually asked if there were any more carrots he could try. "You are going to make yourself sick," Mira said, though she was already pulling a small bunch from the soil to hand him. "I have a very strong stomach," he said, biting into one immediately. "It is one of my better qualities. I am sure there are others." "A few," he said, and grinned at her, and something about that grin, wide and warm and just slightly self-conscious, made her heart do that strange flip again. She told herself, walking back to her quarters that evening, that it meant nothing. He was clearly a man of some standing, given his fine coats and his easy manner, and men of standing did not spend their mornings sitting on garden walls talking to clumsy Omega gardeners because they meant anything by it. He was likely bored, or lonely, or simply passing time, until something more important called him away. She should enjoy his company while it lasted, and not read anything more into it. But he came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Each time he brought something small, a pastry, a bit of cheese, once a handful of dried fruit he claimed to have stolen from the kitchen stores, though she suspected he had simply asked for it and been given whatever he wanted. Each time they talked, and each time he ate whatever she offered him from the garden, with the same enthusiasm as the very first day, as though carrots pulled straight from the dirt were the finest meal available anywhere in the kingdom. By the end of the first week, Mira found herself looking forward to mornings in a way she had not in a very long time. She woke earlier, dressed more carefully, though she told herself it was simply because the mornings were growing warmer and she wanted to be comfortable while she worked. She caught herself smiling, at nothing in particular during the long afternoons, replaying something Barros had said, some joke or observation that had made her laugh harder than she had in months. She also noticed things about him that did not quite add up. The guards near the garden gate, usually gruff and unbothered by anyone's comings and goings, seemed to straighten slightly whenever Barros passed, though he waved them off with easy familiarity each time, as though asking them not to make a fuss. Once, she saw a servant hurry toward him, with an urgent message, only for Barros to wave the woman away with a quick word, and a look that Mira could not quite interpret, somewhere between apologetic and impatient. And there was the matter of his clothes, always fine, always well made, even if they fit a bit snugly across his broad middle, clothes that a garden worker or a common guard could never have afforded. She asked him about it, eventually, on the 9th morning, as he sat on the low wall finishing off the last of a meat pie he had brought with him. "Who are you, really?" she asked. "You dress well. People treat you strangely. You have time to sit in a garden every morning for over a week. What do you actually do here?" Barros went still for a moment, the pie halfway to his mouth. Then he set it down carefully on the cloth in his lap and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, serious, almost nervous. "Does it matter?" he asked quietly. "What I do, I mean. Would it change anything?" "I do not know," Mira said honestly. It might not, but I would rather know the truth than keep wondering." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the rows of vegetables, the morning light catching the soft curve of his face, and Mira found herself holding her breath, unsure what she was waiting for. "I work close to the crown," he said finally, which was, Mira would realize much later, not exactly a lie, though it was very far from the whole truth. "Close enough that people watch what I do. Close enough that most conversations I have are not really conversations at all. They are performances. Everyone wants something from me, or wants to be seen with me, or wants to report back to someone else about what I said and how I looked while saying it." "That sounds exhausting," Mira said softly. "It is." He picked the pie back up but did not eat it, just turned it over in his hands. "This garden is the only place where none of that happens. You do not want anything from me. You do not care who I know or what I can offer you. You just talk to me like I am a person who happens to like carrots too much." "You do like carrots too much," Mira said, trying to lighten the sudden weight in the air, and was relieved when he laughed, that same warm, surprised laugh that she had grown fond of over the past week and a half. "I like a lot of things too much," he admitted. "Carrots, pastries. Sitting here talking to you, instead of doing whatever it is I am supposed to be doing this morning." "You should not neglect your duties on my account," Mira said, though she did not entirely mean it. "You are not the reason I neglect my duties," Burroughs said, standing and brushing crumbs from his coat. "You are the reason I actually look forward to something during the day. There is a difference." He left shortly after that, promising to return the next morning as he always did, and Mira sat alone in the garden for a long while after he had gone, turning his words over in her mind. She did not know who he really was, not yet, not the truth of it, but she had begun to suspect, in the quiet way one suspects things they are not ready to fully believe, that whoever he was someone whose life extended far beyond garden walls and stolen pastries, someone whose attention toward her would eventually have consequences neither of them could avoid. For now, though, she pushed the thought aside. She had learned, over years of disappointment, not to reach too eagerly for things that felt too good to be true. She would enjoy the mornings while they lasted, the easy conversation, and the warm laughter, and the strange comfort of being truly listened to for the first time, in longer than she could remember. Whatever came after, she decided, she would face when it arrived, not before. She gathered her tools and returned to her work, though her mind stayed in the garden long after her hands moved on to other tasks, replaying the look on Barros's face when he had spoken about performances and people wanting things from him, and wondering, despite herself, what exactly it was that a man like that could possibly want from someone like her. The answer, though she did not know it yet, was closer and stranger than she could have imagined, and it was already beginning to unfold, one shared pastry and one stolen carrot at a time, in the quiet corner of the garden where nobody thought to look for a king. The truth came out on a Tuesday, and it came out because of a steward who did not know any better. Mira was kneeling among the tomato vines, tying loose stems to their wooden stakes, while Barros sat nearby, recounting a story about a peacock that had somehow found its way into the royal kitchens the previous winter, and refused to leave for 3 days. She was laughing so hard she nearly dropped her twine, when a thin, harried man in palace livery came rushing down the garden path, clutching a scroll to his chest. "Your Majesty," the steward said, bowing so quickly he nearly overbalanced. "Forgive the interruption, but the delegation from the northern provinces has arrived early, and the council is asking for you immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mira's hands went still on the twine. She looked up slowly, first at the steward, then at Barros, waiting for some explanation, some joke that would make sense of what she had just heard. Barros did not laugh. He closed his eyes briefly, the way a man does when a very unwelcome truth has just been dragged out into the light. "Thank you," he said to the steward, his voice quiet and controlled, in a way Mira had never heard from him before. "Tell them I will be along shortly." The steward bowed again and hurried off, clearly relieved to have delivered his message, and equally eager to escape whatever tension had settled over the garden. Mira sat back on her heels, still holding the twine, staring at Barros, as though seeing him for the first time. "Your Majesty," she repeated slowly. "Mira, you are the king." It was not a question. She could hear the pieces falling into place, even as she said it. The fine clothes, the deferential guards, the servant who had once hurried toward him with an urgent message before being waved away, the way he spoke about performances and people wanting things from him. "You are King Barros. You let me throw carrots at you. I threatened to send you home for being too full. I told you that your dignity was not very important." "You did," he said, and there was a nervous edge to his voice she had never heard before, something almost pleading. "And it was the best conversation I have had in years. You should have told me." Mira stood up too quickly, brushing dirt from her knees, her mind racing through every casual thing she had said to him over the past week and a half, every joke, every complaint about palace life, every small confession she had shared without a second thought, because she believed she was speaking to an ordinary man. "I spoke to you as though you were nobody important. Do you understand what could happen to me for that? For treating the king so carelessly?" Nothing is going to happen to you, Barros said firmly, standing as well, though he kept a careful distance, as if he understood that closing the space between them right now would only make things worse. I am not upset with you, Mira. I have never once been upset with you. If anything, I have been grateful every single morning that you did not know who I was. That is easy for you to say. Her voice cracked slightly, and she hated how vulnerable it sounded. You have all the power here, I have none. If word gets out that I spoke to the king as though he were a common guard, mocked his appetite, and threatened to send him home, I could lose everything. My position, my place at this palace, everything my family depends on. That will not happen. His voice had gone hard now, certain in a way that surprised her. I will not allow it. You cannot promise that. You do not control what people say, even if you are the king. I can promise it, he said, because the only person who knows what happened in this garden besides you is me, and I have no intention of telling anyone anything, except that I enjoyed excellent conversation with a very skilled gardener. Mira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold, despite the warm morning sun. Why did you not tell me from the beginning? Barros was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by something rawer and more honest than she had heard from him before. Because the moment people know I am the king, everything changes, he said. You would have bowed instead of laughing at me. You would have chosen your words carefully, instead of telling me the truth. You would have offered me your best vegetables instead of the ones you accidentally threw at my feet, and honestly, Mira, the accidental ones were the best thing that had happened to me in months. He looked up at her, and his eyes were tired in a way that made him look older than she had first thought. I did not want a performance. I wanted one real conversation with one real person who did not care what my title was. You gave me that, whether you meant to or not, and I was too selfish to give it up by telling you the truth. Mira did not know what to say. Her anger, which had flared so quickly, began to soften at the edges, though it did not disappear entirely. She understood, in a distant way, what he meant. She had seen how people around the palace changed their behavior the moment rank entered a room, how servants stiffened and nobles postured, and everyone seemed to be performing some version of themselves designed to please whoever held power over them. She could imagine, if she tried, what it might be like to live entirely inside that performance, never certain if anyone around you liked you or simply liked what you could give them. But understanding did not erase the fear settling in her stomach. She was an Omega who worked in the dirt, who tripped over her own feet and dropped trays, and had, only a week and a half ago, hit her king in the boot with a carrot and told him not to eat like an animal. The gap between them had always existed, she simply had not known its true size, and now that she did, it felt impossibly wide. I need time, she said finally, to think about this. That is fair, Barros said quietly. Take whatever time you need. I am not going anywhere. Well, a small, tired smile crossed his face. I am going to a council meeting right now, which I would very much rather avoid, but I am not going anywhere in the sense that matters. Despite everything, Mira felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. You should not keep the northern delegation waiting on my account. No, he agreed. I probably should not. He hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, then seemed to think better of it. He gave her a small bow, formal and strange after so many days of easy friendship, and turned to leave. Barros, she called after him, before she could stop herself. He turned back, hope flickering openly across his face. Thank you for telling me, she said, even if it was late. He nodded once, and something in his shoulders loosened, as though he had been bracing for a much harder rejection. Then he was gone, striding back toward the palace, with the same purposeful walk she imagined he used in every room, except this garden, and Mira was left alone among the tomato vines, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and something else she did not want to name yet. She did not see him again for 3 days. At first she told herself it was simply because he was occupied with the northern delegation, that matters of state naturally took priority over garden conversations with a clumsy Omega gardener. But as the days stretched on, doubt crept in. Perhaps he had reconsidered. Perhaps, once returned to the world of councils and titles and formal duties, he had realized how foolish it had been to spend so many mornings with someone so far beneath his station. Perhaps their conversations had been, after all, nothing more than a brief distraction, now discarded in favor of whatever more important business a king actually attended to. She threw herself into her work during those 3 days, weeding with more force than necessary, replanting an entire row of herbs that did not truly need replanting, anything to keep her hands busy, and her mind from wandering back to the low garden wall where he used to sit. The other garden staff noticed her unusual quiet and asked, once or twice, if something was wrong, but she brushed off their concerns with vague answers about being tired. On the 4th morning, she arrived at the garden to find the low wall empty, as it had been for 3 days now, and felt a heavy disappointment settle over her that she was almost ashamed of. She had known him for less than 2 weeks. She had no right to feel this sense of loss over a friendship, if that was even the right word for whatever had grown between them, that had barely had time to take root. She was halfway through weeding the 2nd row of beans when she heard footsteps on the path, heavier and more hesitant than she remembered, and looked up to find Barrows standing there, dressed not in his usual fine coat, but in something plainer, simpler, as though he had deliberately chosen clothing that would not draw attention. "I was not sure you would want to see me," he said. Mira sat back on her heels, studying him. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him, dark circles beneath his eyes, and a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. "The council meetings did not go well?" "They went exactly as council meetings always go," he said, with a weary attempt at his old humor. "Long, tedious, full of men arguing about grain taxes, while pretending it is a matter of great honor. I would have rather spent every single one of those 3 days here." "Then why did you not come?" "Because I thought you needed space," he said simply, "and because, if I am honest, I was afraid you would tell me you did not want to see me again, and I was not ready to hear that yet. It seemed easier to stay away, and imagine you might still want me here, than to come and find out for certain that you did not." Mira set down her trowel and stood, brushing dirt from her hands, considering him carefully. 3 days of quiet reflection had given her time to sort through her fear, and her anger, and the strange hurt of feeling deceived, and what remained, underneath all of it, was something simpler. She had missed him, missed the sound of his laugh, the way he listened as though her words mattered, the comfort of a friendship that had, however briefly, made her feel like more than the clumsy girl who dropped things. "I do want you here," she said finally. "I was angry that you did not tell me sooner. I am still a little angry, honestly, but I do not want you to stay away." Relief broke across his face so openly that she almost laughed. He crossed the remaining distance between them and, before she quite understood what he intended, reached into his coat and produced a slightly crushed pastry. "Peace offering," he said. "It has been sitting in my pocket since this morning's breakfast, so it is not at its best, but the intention is good." She took it, laughing despite herself, and the tightness that had lived in her chest for 3 days finally began to ease. "You truly cannot help yourself, can you?" "Not around you," he admitted, settling back onto the low garden wall, as though he had never left, as though 3 days of anxious waiting had not passed between them. "I missed this. I missed you. I know that probably sounds strange, given how little time we have actually known each other." "It does not sound as strange as it should," Mira said, sitting down across from him among the bean rows. "I missed you too." They talked for a long while that morning, more carefully than before, both of them aware now of the truth that sat between them, the crown and the title, and everything it meant for 2 people who came from such different worlds to sit together in a garden and pretend, for an hour, that none of it mattered. Barrows told her, haltingly at first and then with more openness, about the pressures of ruling, the constant demands of nobles who wanted favors, and councils who wanted decisions, and a kingdom that expected him to be strong and decisive at every moment, never tired, never uncertain, never simply a man who liked carrots too much and laughed too easily. Mira listened, and found herself understanding him more with every word, seeing past the crown to the person underneath it, a person who was, in many ways, just as lonely and just as uncertain as she was, hidden behind a title instead of a reputation for clumsiness. By the time she needed to return to her work, something had shifted between them again, deeper and more fragile than before, built now on honesty instead of ignorance. Mira did not know what would come of it, whether a king could truly build a lasting connection with an ordinary gardener, whether the walls of rank and expectation that surrounded him would eventually crush whatever was growing between them. But as she watched him walk away, glancing back twice with a small, hopeful smile, she found that she wanted to find out, whatever the cost might turn out to be. Word of the king's frequent visits to the garden spread through the palace faster than either of them expected, and it was Barros's younger sister, Wren, who confronted him first. She found him in his private study late one evening, a plate of bread and cheese balanced on his knee, as he pretended to review reports he had clearly not read. Wren closed the door behind her with a firm click and crossed her arms. "You have been sneaking off to the garden every morning for 2 weeks," she said without preamble. "The guards talk, the kitchen staff talk. Even old Councillor Hale mentioned it to me, and that man barely notices anything that is not written on a piece of parchment." Barros did not look up from his plate. "I like gardens. You like gardens the way I like council meetings, which is to say not at all, unless there is something else drawing you there." Wren sat down across from him, her expression softening slightly. She was younger than him by 4 years, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, and one of the very few people in the palace who spoke to him without a trace of careful deference. "Who is she, Barros?" He set down his bread, considered lying, and decided against it. Wren would find out eventually, and he had learned long ago that hiding things from his sister only ever made matters worse. "Her name is Mira. She works in the royal garden." "A gardener?" Wren's eyebrows rose. "That is going to cause problems, you understand that?" "I understand it," he said quietly, "but I am not sure I care as much as I probably should." Wren studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from suspicion to concern. "You truly like her." "More than I expected to," he admitted. "She does not care that I am king. She spoke to me like an ordinary person for over a week, before she even knew who I was. And even now that she knows, she still argues with me, and teases me, and tells me when I am being ridiculous. Nobody else does that, Wren. Not you, not the council, not anyone at court. Everyone else calculates every word before they say it." "I argue with you," Wren said. "You are my sister. That does not count." Wren allowed herself a small smile at that, though it faded quickly. "The court will not be kind about this, you know that. A king courting a common gardener, an omega, with no family name worth mentioning, no dowry, no connections that benefit the crown. The nobles will say you are being reckless. Some of them will say worse." "I know," Barros said, and the weight in his voice told her he had already thought through every possible objection long before she raised them. "But I have spent my entire reign doing what was expected of me. I chose advisors the council approved of. I signed treaties that benefited noble families more than common ones. I have smiled through 1,000 tedious functions and said all the right things to all the right people. And in all that time, I cannot remember the last time I felt like myself, rather than a role I was playing." He looked up at his sister, and there was real vulnerability in his eyes. "For the first time in years, I feel like myself around her. I do not want to give that up, just because it is inconvenient for people who have never had to sacrifice anything for my happiness." Wren was quiet for a long moment, turning his words over. "You have thought about this seriously then. This is not simply a passing interest." "It is not passing," he said firmly. "I intend to court her properly, if she will allow it." "Then you should prepare yourself," Wren said, standing and smoothing her skirts. "Because if you truly mean to pursue this, the court will test her, and they will test you both, far more harshly than a stray comment from Councillor Hale." Her warning proved accurate sooner than either of them expected. The following week, Barros invited Mira to a small private dinner in one of the palace's quieter dining rooms, away from the formal halls where court business was usually conducted. He had told her, gently, that this was a step he wanted to take carefully, that he was not yet ready to announce their connection publicly, but wanted to give her an evening that felt less like sneaking around a garden and more like an actual courtship. Mira had been nervous all day, changing her plain work dress for the one nicer gown she owned, a soft blue thing she had worn only twice before, at her cousin's wedding and at a village festival years ago. She fussed with her hair longer than she cared to admit, and when she finally arrived at the small dining room, escorted quietly by a servant who seemed to know exactly what was happening and exactly why it needed to remain discreet, she found Barros, already waiting, dressed in dark green, looking almost nervous himself. "You look wonderful," he said, standing so quickly he nearly knocked over his own chair. "You look like you are about to be sick," she said, unable to hold back a small laugh. "I might be," he admitted, pulling out her chair for her. "I have negotiated trade agreements with foreign delegations who wanted to go to war with us, and none of that made me half as nervous as this dinner." The meal itself was simple by palace standards: roasted chicken, fresh bread, a modest selection of vegetables that Mira suspected had been specifically chosen because Barros knew she would appreciate seeing something familiar on a table, so much finer than what she was used to. They talked easily once the initial nervousness faded, falling back into the comfortable rhythm they had built in the garden, though there was a new tenderness to it now, an unspoken acknowledgement that this dinner meant something more than their morning conversations had. It was near the end of the meal, as a servant cleared away the plates, that the door opened without warning, and a tall, elegant woman swept into the room, trailed by two attendants who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Lady Isolde," Barros said, his easy expression vanishing instantly, replaced by a careful neutrality that Mira recognized now as the mask he wore for anyone outside their private world. "I was not aware you had returned to court." "Clearly," Lady Isolde said, her gaze sweeping over Mira, with an assessment so thorough and so cold that Mira felt her cheeks flush. "I arrived this afternoon, and was told, to my great surprise, that His Majesty was dining privately with a member of the garden staff. I confess, I had to see it for myself." Mira had never met the woman before, but she recognized the name instantly from overheard palace gossip. Lady Isolde was the daughter of one of the kingdom's most powerful noble families, and for years the court had assumed, correctly or not, that she was the most likely candidate to eventually become queen. Her beauty was undeniable, sharp and polished in a way that made Mira acutely aware of her own plain gown and simply styled hair. "Lady Isolde, this is Mira," Barros said evenly. "She tends the royal garden, and she is my guest this evening." "How charming," Lady Isolde said, in a tone that suggested she found nothing charming about it at all. "Tell me, garden girl, how does one go about securing a private dinner with the king? I have been trying for months to arrange even a brief audience." "I did not secure anything," Mira said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, despite the way her heart pounded. "His Majesty was kind enough to invite me." "Was he?" Lady Isolde's eyes flicked back to Barros, sharp and assessing. "How generous of you, Your Majesty, to extend such kindness to the staff. Perhaps you might consider extending similar kindness to those of us who have spent years cultivating relationships that actually benefit the kingdom." "I appreciate your concern for the kingdom, Lady Isolde," Barros said, his tone cool now, in a way Mira had not heard from him before. "But my private dinners are exactly that." "Private? I did not realize they required your approval." A flash of anger crossed Lady Isolde's face before she smoothed it away, replacing it with a thin, brittle smile. "Of course not, Your Majesty. Forgive my intrusion. I simply wish to welcome your guest properly." She turned that same cold assessment on Mira once more. "Enjoy your evening, garden girl. I am sure it will not last long." She swept out as suddenly as she had entered, her attendants scurrying after her, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence once the door closed behind them. "I am sorry about that," Barros said quietly, reaching across the table to take Mira's hand. "She has always assumed she would be queen someday. My father encouraged the idea when I was younger, before I made clear it was not something I wanted. She seemed very certain that this," Mira gestured vaguely between them, "will not last." "She is wrong," Barros said, with a firmness that steadied something in Mira's chest. "But I understand, if tonight has made you nervous about what we are starting. Isolde is only the beginning. There will be others like her, worse than her, who will say far crueler things than what you just heard." Mira was quiet for a moment, absorbing this, feeling the shine of the evening dim slightly, under the weight of what Lady Isolde's visit had revealed. "I knew, in a distant way, that this would be difficult," she said finally. "But hearing it, seeing the way she looked at me, as though I did not belong anywhere near this table, made it feel very real, in a way it had not before." "You belong wherever I choose to have you," Barros said. "That is not simply flattery, Mira. I mean it. If people like Isolde cannot accept that, the difficulty is theirs to manage, not yours." "That is easy to say," Mira said softly, But I am the one who has to walk through the palace corridors afterward, past people who whisper and stare. You return to your council meetings and your reports. I return to a kitchen full of staff who will have heard about tonight before I even finish walking back. Barros's expression sobered, and he squeezed her hand gently. You are right. I have not had to think enough about what this costs you specifically, versus what it costs me. I am sorry for that. I do not say it to make you feel guilty, she said. I say it because I need you to understand that if we continue this, I will need you to actually see what I am facing, not just assume that your affection is enough to shield me from it. I will see it, he promised. I will do better. They finished the evening, more quietly than it had begun, the earlier ease between them tempered now by the reality Lady Isolde had introduced into the room. Mira walked back to her quarters that night, turning the encounter over and over in her mind, and though she did not regret accepting the dinner invitation, she understood now, with a clarity she had not possessed before, exactly how steep the road ahead of them would be. News of Lady Isolde's confrontation reached the kitchen staff by morning, embellished and reshaped through several retellings, until it bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. Mira endured curious glances and a few pointed questions throughout the day, deflecting as best she could, grateful that the head cook, a stern but fair woman named Petra, put a swift end to the gossip by threatening to reassign anyone who spent more time speculating than working. Barros found her in the garden the next morning, as he always did, though there was a new seriousness to his visit. I spoke with my council this morning, he said, settling onto the low wall. I told them I intend to court you properly, and that I expect them to treat you with the respect owed to someone I am courting, regardless of her origins. How did that go? About as well as you would expect, he said dryly. Several of them are concerned about precedent. A few were more direct about their objections than I appreciated, but it is done now. It is no longer a secret confined to whispers and a chance encounter with Isolde. The court knows, officially, that I care for you. Mira felt a complicated mixture of relief and dread settle in her chest. Relief, because the uncertainty of secrecy had worn on her more than she had admitted even to herself. Dread, because official knowledge meant official scrutiny, and she suspected the days ahead would test her in ways she had not yet imagined. Thank you for telling them, she said finally. And for standing by it, even knowing how they would react. You are worth standing by, Barros said simply, and though the words were plain, the sincerity in his voice settled something anxious in her chest, enough that she allowed herself, for a moment, to believe that whatever came next, they might actually be able to face it together. The morning after Barros made his intentions known to the council, Mira woke to find a folded note slipped beneath her door. Her name was written on the front, in careful, elegant handwriting she did not recognize, and when she opened it, her stomach turned cold. Garden Girl, it read. Some doors were never meant to open for people like you. Close this one yourself before it closes on you. There was no signature, but she did not need one. She thought of Lady Isolde's sharp eyes and colder smile, and though she could not prove who had written the note, she had little doubt about where it had come from. She did not tell Barros right away. She folded the note and tucked it into the bottom of her trunk, telling herself it was nothing more than an empty threat meant to frighten her. The kind of cruelty that people with too much time and too much resentment sometimes indulged in. She went about her work that morning as though nothing had happened, weeding and watering and trying to focus on the steady, familiar rhythm of the garden, instead of the cold knot of fear sitting in her chest. Barros noticed anyway. He always noticed, which she was still adjusting to after years of people barely noticing her at all. You are quiet today, he said, settling onto the low wall with his usual breakfast pastry. Though this morning, he did not eat it right away, simply held it, watching her. I am fine, she said, not looking up from the row of lettuce she was thinning. Mira, his voice was gentle but firm, the tone he used, she had learned, when he intended to press a point rather than let it go. You have not smiled once since I arrived. You always smile, even when you are annoyed with me. Something happened. She hesitated, torn between not wanting to burden him, and knowing, from their conversation after Lady Isolde's confrontation, that hiding things from him would only make matters worse in the long run. Finally, with a sigh, she retrieved the folded note from her apron pocket, where she had tucked it that morning without quite deciding to, and handed it to him. Barros read it twice, his expression darkening with each pass. "Who left this?" "I do not know for certain," she admitted. "But I have a guess. Isolde." His jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had known him, Mira saw a flash of genuine anger cross his face, sharp and cold, nothing like the warm, easy man she had grown used to. "This is unacceptable. Threatening you, even indirectly, is unacceptable." "It might not have been her," Mira said, though she did not fully believe it herself. "It could have been anyone. There are plenty of people at court who do not like the idea of an Omega gardener courting the king." "That does not make it acceptable," Barrows said. "And it does not mean I will simply ignore it." He stood, tucking the note carefully into his coat. "I am going to speak with the council about this immediately." "Barrows, wait." Mira caught his sleeve, and he stopped, looking down at her with a mixture of frustration and concern. "If you go storming into the council chamber accusing Lady Isolde without proof, it will only make things worse. It will look like you are protecting me out of favoritism rather than justice, and it will give her family more reason to resent me."
"So, I should do nothing?"
"I did not say that," Mira said. "I am saying you should be careful. Find proof before you act. Otherwise you risk making an enemy of an entire noble family over an accusation you cannot substantiate." Barrows studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, admiration mixing with his lingering anger. "You think more clearly about this than I do." "I have had more practice thinking carefully before acting," she said, with a small, tired smile. "It comes from a lifetime of tripping over things because I did not look where I was going. I learned, eventually, to think first." He let out a short laugh despite himself, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Very well, I will be careful. But I will not simply let this go, Mira. If someone at this court believes they can threaten you and face no consequences, they are mistaken." True to his word, Barrows did not confront Lady Isolde directly, but Mira noticed, over the following days, subtle shifts in how the court operated around her. Extra guards seemed to patrol near the garden during her working hours. A quiet, watchful woman named Della, who Mira later learned was one of Wren's most trusted attendants, began appearing at odd moments throughout Mira's day, ostensibly running errands but always somehow nearby. The added attention made Mira uncomfortable at first, a constant reminder that she had become someone worth threatening, someone whose safety required careful management. But she also found a strange comfort in it, evidence that Barrows's promise to see what she faced and to actually address it had not been empty words. The threatening note was not repeated, at least not in writing, but the cruelty found other outlets. Whispers followed her through the palace corridors now, no longer hidden behind hands and turned backs but spoken just loudly enough for her to hear. She overheard a group of young noblewomen laughing about her clumsiness, wondering aloud how long it would take before she embarrassed herself badly enough that the king lost interest. A steward who had once been perfectly polite to her began finding excuses to delay her requests, small inconveniences that added up over the course of a difficult week. She endured it as best she could, drawing on the same quiet resilience that had carried her through years of village gossip about her failed courtships and her awkward manner. She had learned long ago that responding to cruelty with visible hurt only encouraged more of it, so she kept her expression neutral, her work steady, and her complaints, when she allowed herself any at all, confined to quiet evenings alone in her small room. Wren found her there one evening, nearly a week after the note had arrived, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at nothing in particular. "You look like someone who has had a very long day," Wren said, letting herself in without waiting for an invitation, a habit Mira was still adjusting to. "It has been a long week," Mira admitted. "I have heard some of what people are saying," Wren said, settling into the room's single chair. "Barrows does not know the full extent of it. He suspects, but you have been careful not to tell him everything, I think, out of some misguided desire to protect him from worry." Mira flushed slightly, caught out. "He has enough to manage without adding my troubles to the list." "Your troubles are his troubles, whether either of you likes it or not," Wren said, not unkindly. "That is what it means for him to court you seriously. But I understand why you have not told him everything. He has a temper when it comes to people he cares about, and you are worried he will make things worse by acting rashly." "Something like that," Mira said. Ren was quiet for a moment, studying her with an assessing look that reminded Mira strongly of her brother. "Can I offer you some advice, garden girl? From someone who has spent her entire life navigating this court? Please. Stop trying to earn their approval," Ren said. "You will not succeed. Not through kindness, not through patience, not through proving yourself worthy in whatever way you imagine might satisfy them. Nobles like Isolde do not resent you because you have done anything wrong. They resent you because you represent something they cannot control. A king who chooses affection over advantage, and no amount of good behavior on your part will change that fundamental resentment. Then what should I do?" "Endure it," Ren said simply. "Endure it, and let it show that you are stronger than they expect. The worst thing you could do is disappear quietly. Prove them right, that you do not belong here. The best thing you can do is stay, exactly as you are, clumsy and plain-spoken and unimpressed by their titles, and let your continued presence be its own answer to their cruelty." Mira turned the words over, finding a strange strength in them despite their bluntness. "That is easier advice to give than to follow. Most good advice is," Ren said with a small, wry smile. "But you have already been following it, whether you realized it or not. You are still here. You have not run. That counts for more than you think." Mira managed a small smile of her own, some of the week's accumulated weight easing slightly at the sight of Ren's genuine support. "Thank you for coming to check on me." "Do not thank me yet," Ren said, standing to leave. "I only came because my brother has been unbearable all week, snapping at council members and barely eating his meals with any enthusiasm, which for him is a serious sign of distress. I needed to understand what was wrong with him, and it turns out the answer is you, or rather, his worry over what you are enduring on his behalf." The mention of Barros's own struggle softened something in Mira's chest. She had been so focused on protecting him from worry that she had not fully considered how her silence might be affecting him regardless, filling in the gaps with his own imagination, likely worse than the reality. She found him the next morning in the garden earlier than usual, sitting on the low wall with dark circles beneath his eyes, and a stillness to him that told her Ren had spoken truly about his week. "I have not been fully honest with you," Mira said, sitting down beside him without preamble. "About how difficult this week has been." Barros turned to her, and something in his face, tired and worried and achingly fond all at once, made her chest tighten. "Tell me now," he said quietly, "all of it. I would rather know and worry than be kept in the dark and worry anyway, imagining things that might be worse than the truth." So she told him, the whispers and the small cruelties, the delayed requests and the laughter she was meant to overhear. And though his jaw tightened with each detail, he did not interrupt, did not rush to solve or dismiss what she described, simply listened, the way he always had, as though her words mattered more than anything else he might have been doing that morning. "I am sorry," he said, when she finished. "I am sorry. This is the cost of caring for me. And I am sorry I did not push harder to know sooner. I did not want to burden you," she admitted. "You are not a burden," he said, taking her hand in both of his, larger and warmer than she had grown accustomed to expect from anyone in her life. "You are the reason I still feel like myself, in a place that has spent years trying to turn me into something else entirely. Please, from now on, let me carry some of this with you. I cannot fix every unkind word spoken behind your back, but I can at least make sure you do not carry the weight of it alone." Mira nodded, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound for days. "I would like that." They sat together for a long while after that, not talking much, simply existing in each other's company, in the quiet garden. And though the whispers and cruelty of the court had not disappeared, Mira found that facing them felt more bearable now, knowing that whatever came next, she would not have to face it entirely on her own. Autumn arrived, and with it came the kingdom's harvest festival, an event that drew nobles and common folk alike into the palace grounds for 3 days of feasting, dancing, and displays of the year's finest crops. It was, Barros told Mira over breakfast one morning, the perfect opportunity to formally introduce her to the court as someone he was courting, rather than a rumor whispered behind closed doors. "I would like you to stand beside me during the opening ceremony," he said, watching her carefully for her reaction. "Not hidden away, not treated as a secret, openly, as someone I care for." Mira's stomach twisted with nerves at the thought, memories of Lady Isolde's cold assessment, and the anonymous note still fresh enough to make her cautious. Everyone will be watching. Everyone is already watching, Barros pointed out gently. Whispering about us has become something of a favorite pastime at court this season. I would rather they watch us stand together with confidence than watch us continue to hide as though we have something to be ashamed of. She could not argue with his logic, even as anxiety pooled in her stomach at the thought of standing before the entire court, exposed and visible, in a way she had never been before. Still, she agreed, and the following days passed in a strange blur of preparation. Wren, who had appointed herself something like an unofficial guide through the treacherous waters of court expectation, arranged for a seamstress to create a gown suited for the occasion, something elegant but not so extravagant that it would appear as though Mira were trying to claim a status she had not yet earned. The morning of the festival's opening ceremony arrived with a crispness in the air that Mira might have enjoyed under different circumstances. As it was, she stood in her chambers while an attendant fussed over the final touches of her gown. A deep amber color that Wren had insisted suited her far better than the pale blues and pinks typically favored by court fashion, and tried to steady the frantic rhythm of her heart. "You look lovely," the attendant said, stepping back to admire her work. "I look like I am about to be sick," Mira replied honestly, staring at her reflection in the small mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed almost unrecognizable, hair carefully arranged, gown fitted precisely to her frame, and yet beneath the finery, she still felt exactly like the same clumsy girl who had once walked directly into a closed door in front of half the kitchen staff. Barros arrived to collect her personally, which she understood, even in her nervous state, to be a significant gesture. Kings did not typically fetch their guests themselves, leaving such tasks to servants and attendants, but he stood in her doorway dressed in formal deep blue, his expression softening the moment he saw her. "You look magnificent," he said, and the sincerity in his voice steadied her nerves more than any amount of careful preparation had managed. "I feel like I might trip and fall in front of the entire kingdom," she admitted. "Then we will fall together," he said, offering his arm with a small, reassuring smile. "And I imagine the court will have far more interesting things to say about a king who falls beside his chosen companion than about an Omega who stumbles alone." She laughed despite herself, some of the tension in her shoulders easing, and together they walked toward the great hall, where the opening ceremony would take place. The hall was already crowded when they arrived, nobles in their finest autumn colors clustered in small groups, their conversations quieting, as Barros and Mira entered together. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes settle on her, assessing, judging, and forced herself to keep her chin level and her steps steady, remembering Wren's advice from weeks earlier about the power of simply enduring, of refusing to disappear quietly. Barros led her to the raised platform at the front of the hall, where he would formally open the festival with a traditional address to the assembled court. As they climbed the short steps, Mira caught sight of Lady Isolde standing near the front of the crowd, dressed in a deep crimson gown, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes sharp and calculating as they tracked Mira's every movement. Mira forced herself to hold the woman's gaze for a brief moment before turning her attention back to Barros, refusing to let the confrontation from weeks earlier rattle her now, in front of so many watching eyes. Barros's address was brief and traditional, thanking the kingdom's farmers for their labor and wishing prosperity for the coming year. But as he neared the end of his prepared remarks, he paused, and Mira felt her heart begin to race again, sensing that he intended to deviate from whatever the council had likely prepared for him. "Before I conclude," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, "I would like to introduce someone many of you have already heard whispers about." He turned to Mira, offering his hand, and she stepped forward beside him, despite the trembling in her legs. "This is Mira. She tends the royal garden, and she has become someone very important to me over these past weeks. I know there has been talk at court regarding our connection, and rather than allow rumor and speculation to continue shaping the narrative, I wanted to state plainly, in front of all of you, that I am courting her, and I intend to continue doing so regardless of whatever objections might exist regarding her origins." A murmur swept through the crowd, a mixture of surprise and, in some quarters, poorly concealed disapproval. Mira kept her expression as steady as she could manage, aware that every flicker of emotion would be scrutinized and discussed long after the festival ended. "I understand," Barros continued. that some among you believe a king's affections should be guided by strategic advantage rather than personal choice. I have spent my entire reign making decisions guided by strategy, by the expectations of this court, by the weight of tradition. In this matter, I have chosen to make a decision guided by something else entirely, and I ask that you extend to Mira the same respect you would extend to anyone I have chosen to honor with my attention." The silence that followed felt endless to Mira, though it likely lasted only a few seconds. Then, to her surprise, scattered applause began, first from a small cluster of younger nobles near the back of the hall, then spreading gradually, as more of the crowd joined in, though she noticed several prominent faces, Lady Isolde chief among them, remaining pointedly still, their hands folded, and their expressions cold. The rest of the ceremony passed in something of a blur for Mira. Formal introductions and careful conversations with nobles who approached her with varying degrees of genuine curiosity and thinly veiled skepticism. She managed, through sheer force of will and the steady presence of Barros beside her, to navigate the afternoon without any significant missteps, though her feet ached fiercely by the time the formal portion of the festival concluded and the evening's more relaxed feasting began. It was during the feast, as the great hall filled with the sounds of music and laughter and the clinking of cups, that Mira finally allowed herself to relax slightly, seated beside Barros at the high table, watching him eat with his usual enthusiasm, sampling nearly every dish set before him with visible delight. "You are going to embarrass yourself in front of the entire court," she teased quietly, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks earlier in the garden, back when she had believed him to be nothing more than an ordinary man with an unusual appetite. "I have embarrassed myself in front of this court more times than I can count," he replied cheerfully, reaching for another serving of roasted root vegetables. "They are quite used to it by now." "I find that difficult to believe," Mira said. "You seem so composed during formal occasions." "Composed on the outside," he corrected, "and secretly, counting the minutes until I can eat something, without an audience judging every bite. You are the only person who has ever watched me eat with genuine curiosity, instead of quiet judgment, you know. Everyone else at this table is thinking about how a king with my particular build reflects on the kingdom's prosperity, or lack of discipline, or whatever unflattering conclusion they have decided to draw." "That seems unfair," Mira said, frowning. "You are allowed to enjoy food." "Try telling that to half the council," he said, though his tone remained light. "It matters less to me now than it used to. I have made my peace with being exactly who I am, appetite and all. Though I will admit, it took years to arrive at that peace, and more than a few unkind comments from courtiers who believed a king should look a certain way, regardless of what actually brought him comfort or joy." Mira considered this, understanding suddenly why their earliest conversations in the garden, when she had teased him about eating too many carrots without any awareness of his position, had meant so much to him. She had, without realizing it, offered him something rare, a space where his appetite was simply a charming quirk rather than a subject of judgment, where he could be himself without the weight of a kingdom's expectations pressing down on every choice he made. "I like your appetite," she said simply. "I liked it before I knew you were king, and I like it now. I do not think there is anything wrong with a man who enjoys the things that bring him comfort." Something in Barros's expression softened at her words, warm and grateful, and touched by a sincerity that clearly meant more to him than she had realized. "That is precisely why I could not stop returning to that garden, you know. You saw me clearly, long before you knew who I was, and you liked what you saw anyway." The rest of the feast passed pleasantly enough, though Mira remained aware, throughout the evening, of Lady Isolde's occasional cold glances from across the hall, and of the whispered conversations that seemed to follow wherever she walked. But she found, as the evening wore on, that she cared less about the whispers than she had expected to, buoyed by Barros's steady presence beside her, and the memory of his public declaration, spoken plainly before the entire court, that he had chosen her regardless of the cost. By the time the festival's first day drew to a close, and Mira finally returned to her chambers, exhausted, but strangely lighter than she had felt in weeks, she allowed herself, for the first time, to believe that perhaps this connection between them might truly survive the pressures arrayed against it. The court's disapproval had not vanished, and she suspected it would not vanish easily, if ever. But standing beside Barros in that great hall, Hearing him declare his intentions plainly before nobles who wished her gone, she had felt, for the first time since the anonymous note had arrived beneath her door, something closer to hope than fear. The hope Mira had allowed herself during the harvest festival did not survive the winter that followed. It began, as these things often did, with small cruelties easy enough to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore once they accumulated. A tailor commissioned to prepare new gowns for her, arranged quietly by Wren, suddenly found himself too busy to accept the work, and Mira later learned through a sympathetic kitchen maid named Fenna that Lady Isolde's family had offered him a far larger commission on the condition that he decline any further work for the garden girl. A supplier who had reliably provided seeds and tools for the royal garden began sending shipments late, then incomplete, then eventually not at all, forcing Mira to explain the delays to a frustrated head gardener who had no idea the true cause behind them. Individually, these obstacles might have been endured with patience. Together, over the course of a long, cold winter, they wore at Mira in ways she found increasingly difficult to hide. The cruelest blow came during a formal court gathering in early winter, a smaller, more intimate affair than the harvest festival, attended mostly by the kingdom's most influential noble families. Barrows had insisted Mira attend, believing, rightly, that continued visibility remained important even as the court's disapproval calcified into something colder and more organized. Mira had grown more confident since the festival, more comfortable navigating the careful choreography of court conversation, and she moved through the early part of the evening with a steadiness that surprised even her. It was during a lull in conversation, as she stood near a group of noblewomen she had cautiously begun to consider something like acquaintances, that Lady Isolde approached, flanked by two of her closest allies among the court's younger nobility. "Mira," Lady Isolde said, her voice pleasant enough that a casual observer might have missed the edge beneath it. "I have been meaning to ask you something. Tell me, how does the royal garden compare to whatever you tended back in your village? I imagine it must be quite overwhelming, managing something of such scale after years of tending. What was it, a family vegetable patch?" "The scale took some adjustment," Mira said carefully, "but I have managed well enough." "Well enough," Lady Isolde repeated, exchanging an amused glance with her companions. "How modest. I have heard from several sources that you have actually struggled considerably, that the head gardener has had to correct your work more than once, that certain plantings failed entirely under your care last season." Mira felt her cheeks flush, aware that a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension in Lady Isolde's tone. The accusation contained a kernel of truth, twisted into something far more damaging than reality warranted. She had, in her first months at the palace, made mistakes, typical of any new gardener adjusting to unfamiliar soil and climate, mistakes that had long since been corrected and forgotten by everyone except, apparently, whoever had been carefully collecting stories to use against her. "Every gardener makes mistakes when adjusting to new conditions," Mira said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, despite the growing audience. "I have learned a great deal since my first season here." "I am sure you have," Lady Isolde said, her smile sharpening. "Though I do wonder, given your struggles managing something as simple as a garden, how you imagine yourself capable of managing the responsibilities that might one day come with a closer connection to the crown. Surely you understand the difference between tending vegetables and understanding matters of state, diplomacy, the delicate balance of noble alliances that keeps this kingdom stable." The insinuation was clear enough that a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gathered onlookers, and Mira felt heat rise in her face, humiliation twisting uncomfortably in her stomach. She searched for a response, something that might deflect the attack without escalating the confrontation further, but her thoughts scattered under the weight of so many watching eyes, and for a horrible, silent moment, she found herself unable to speak at all. It was Wren who intervened, appearing suddenly at Mira's side, with a bright, brittle smile fixed firmly on her face. "Lady Isolde," Wren said, her tone carrying just enough warmth to seem friendly, while making clear, to anyone paying close attention, that it was nothing of the sort. "How interesting that you have taken such a close interest in Mira's gardening record. I did not realize you concerned yourself with agricultural matters. Perhaps you might apply that same diligence toward reviewing your own family's grain reports from last season, given the shortfall the council discussed at our last meeting." The gathered crowd's laughter shifted direction abruptly, several nobles exchanging amused glances at the pointed reference to what was apparently a known embarrassment for Lady Isolde's family. Lady Isolde's composed expression cracked, just slightly, before she recovered. "That is an entirely different matter," she said stiffly. "Is it?" Ren said sweetly. "I only meant to suggest that we all have areas where our attention and expertise might be better focused elsewhere. If you will excuse us, I believe Mira promised to help me with something rather urgent." Ren steered Mira away before Lady Isolde could formulate a response, guiding her through the crowd and into a quieter side corridor, where the noise of the gathering faded into distant murmur. "Thank you," Mira said, once they were alone, her voice unsteady with the aftermath of humiliation and adrenaline. "I did not know what to say back there." "You do not always need to say something," Ren said gently. "Sometimes the best response is simply to survive the moment and let someone else handle the counterattack. I have had years of practice trading barbs with Isolde. You will develop your own skills eventually, but there is no shame in needing help while you learn." Mira nodded, though the humiliation of the confrontation still burned uncomfortably in her chest. "She is not going to stop, is she?" "No," Ren said honestly. "She will not. Isolde has spent years believing she was destined to marry my brother, and she is not the type to release that belief gracefully, especially not in favor of someone she considers beneath her notice. You should prepare yourself for more of this, not less, as time goes on." The prediction proved accurate. Over the following weeks, Mira found herself the subject of increasingly elaborate schemes designed to embarrass or discredit her. A rumor circulated that she had been dismissed from a previous position for incompetence, entirely fabricated but difficult to definitively disprove. Someone rearranged tools in the garden shed the night before an important inspection, causing Mira to appear disorganized in front of a visiting dignitary who toured the grounds. A servant, later revealed to be in Lady Isolde's employ, deliberately provided Mira with incorrect information about a formal event's dress requirements, resulting in her arriving inappropriately dressed for a gathering where every other guest wore considerably more formal attire. Each incident chipped away at Mira's confidence, and though Barros did everything within his power to address the more blatant cruelties, formally reprimanding the servant caught providing false information, quietly ensuring the garden shed incident was properly explained to the visiting dignitary, he could not shield her from the accumulated weight of constant scrutiny and calculated humiliation. By the depths of winter, Mira had begun to withdraw, spending less time in public spaces where she might encounter Lady Isolde's schemes, retreating instead into the relative safety of the garden and her small chambers. She noticed, with growing unease, that even her conversations with Barros had begun to carry a heaviness that had not existed during their easier days the previous autumn, both of them aware of the mounting pressure without quite knowing how to relieve it. "You seem distant lately," Barros observed one evening, as they sat together in his private study, a rare moment of quiet, away from prying eyes. "More than just tired, distant, like you are somewhere else even when you are sitting right beside me." Mira considered denying it, then thought better of it, remembering their earlier conversation about honesty and the importance of not carrying burdens alone. "I am tired of fighting," she admitted quietly. "Not fighting with you, but fighting the constant undercurrent of everything else. The whispers, the schemes, the feeling that every mistake I make, however small, will be magnified and used against me. I did not realize, when I agreed to this courtship, how relentless it would feel." Barros's expression grew troubled, and he reached for her hand, holding it carefully between both of his. "I have tried to shield you from as much of it as I can." "I know you have," she said, "and I am grateful. But you cannot shield me from all of it, Barros, not without abandoning your responsibilities as king, to spend every hour standing guard over my reputation. And I do not want that kind of protection, honestly. I want to be strong enough to face this without needing constant rescue." "I do not think needing help makes you weak," Barros said gently. "I know that, logically," Mira said. "But it is difficult to feel strong when every day brings some new small cruelty, designed specifically to make me feel as though I do not belong here." She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts, before continuing more softly. "I have started to wonder, some nights, whether Isolde and the others are right. Whether I truly do not belong in this world. Whether continuing this courtship is fair to you, given everything it seems to cost both of us." "Do not say that," Barros said, his voice sharper than she expected. though she understood the sharpness came from fear rather than anger. Please, Mira, do not let them convince you of something that is not true. You belong here as much as anyone, more than most, because you came to this palace and this court without any inherited advantage, without family connections smoothing your path, and you have still managed to earn the respect of everyone who has actually taken the time to know you, rather than judge you from a distance. It does not always feel that way, she admitted. I know, he said, and I wish I could make it feel different, but I cannot fight this battle for you, not entirely. What I can do is remind you, as often as you need to hear it, that none of what Isolde says reflects the truth of who you are. It only reflects her own fear of losing something she believes she is entitled to. Mira leaned into him, drawing comfort from his steady presence, even as the weight of the winter's accumulated cruelties pressed heavily on her chest. She did not know, in that quiet moment, whether she possessed the strength to endure much more of what the court seemed determined to throw at her, but she also did not yet know how close she was to reaching a breaking point that would test everything she and Barrows had built together, a breaking point that arrived sooner and more painfully than either of them anticipated. The breaking point arrived on a gray morning in late winter, delivered not through whispers or schemes, but through a formal letter bearing the seal of the council itself. Mira was summoned to a small chamber adjoining the main council hall, an unusual and unsettling request that she received with a growing sense of dread as she made her way through the palace corridors. She had never been formally summoned by the council before, and the servant who delivered the message had offered no explanation, only instructions regarding the time and location. She arrived to find 5 council members seated at a long table, including Councillor Hale, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a reputation for shrewd political calculation, and, to her surprise and growing unease, Lady Isolde's father, Lord Corwin, whose presence at what should have been an internal council matter struck her as deeply irregular. Please, sit, Councillor Hale said, gesturing toward a single chair positioned before the long table, arranged in a way that made the meeting feel far more like an interrogation than a conversation. Mira sat, keeping her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their trembling. May I ask what this is regarding? We have called you here, Councillor Hale said, to discuss the ongoing matter of His Majesty's attachment to you and the implications it carries for the stability of this kingdom. I was not aware the council had authority over His Majesty's personal relationships, Mira said, though her voice wavered slightly despite her best efforts. Ordinarily, it does not, Lord Corwin interjected, his tone carrying an edge of barely concealed contempt. But when a king's personal choices begin affecting matters of state, diplomacy, and the confidence of noble families whose continued loyalty this kingdom depends upon, the council has both the right and the responsibility to intervene. What matters of state have been affected? Mira asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer, or some version of it, twisted to serve whatever argument the council intended to present. Councillor Hale slid a document across the table toward her. 3 noble families have withdrawn their support for the Crown's proposed trade agreements with the Southern Territories, citing concerns regarding the King's judgment and priorities. 2 others have quietly begun exploring alliances with neighboring kingdoms, alliances that would traditionally have been secured through marriage negotiations the Crown can no longer credibly pursue, given His Majesty's public declaration regarding his intentions toward you. Mira stared at the document, the words blurring slightly as panic began to creep through her chest. You are saying that my relationship with Barrows, with His Majesty, is causing the kingdom actual harm. We are saying, Lord Corwin said, leaning forward, that a king's marriage has always served as one of his most valuable tools for securing alliances, stability, and prosperity for his people. By declaring his intention to pursue a common gardener instead, His Majesty has effectively discarded that tool, and the consequences are already becoming apparent. He has not married anyone, Mira said. He has simply chosen to spend time with someone he cares about. A distinction that matters little to noble families calculating whether their daughters still have a viable path to the throne, Councillor Hale said, not unkindly, though the words landed with brutal weight regardless. We understand that this is not entirely fair to you, Mira. You did not seek out this connection to cause harm, but intention does not change consequence, and the consequences of this courtship are beginning to threaten the kingdom's stability in ways that concern all of us deeply. Mira felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, and forced them back through sheer will, refusing to let this room of powerful men see her cry. "What are you asking of me?" The council members exchanged glances, and it was Lord Corwin who finally spoke the words that Mira had already begun to dread. "We are asking you to end this courtship," he said plainly, quietly, without public scandal, in a manner that allows His Majesty to save face and gradually rebuild the alliances his choices have jeopardized. "We understand this is a significant sacrifice to ask of you, and the Council is prepared to offer generous compensation, a substantial sum, along with a respectable position at a distant estate, where you might build a comfortable life away from the complications of court." The offer hung in the air, cold and clinical, reducing weeks of genuine connection into a transaction to be resolved with money and distance. Mira felt sick, the room seeming to tilt slightly around her, as the weight of what they were asking settled fully into her understanding. "You want me to simply disappear," she said quietly. "For the good of the kingdom." "We want you to consider the greater good," Councillor Hale corrected gently, though the correction did little to soften the blow. "His Majesty is a good king, but he is also a young man capable of making decisions guided more by personal feeling than strategic wisdom. Someone must consider the long-term stability of this kingdom, and we believe, with respect, that you are in a better position to make this sacrifice gracefully than he is to make it at all." Mira sat in stunned silence for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them offering any comfort. She thought of Barros, of his warmth and his easy laugh, and the way he had stood before the entire court to declare his affection for her, risking exactly the kind of political consequence the council now described in such stark terms. She thought of Wren's advice, delivered months earlier, about enduring rather than disappearing quietly, about refusing to prove the court's cruelty correct. But she also thought of the kingdom itself, of ordinary people, farmers and merchants, and families not unlike her own, who might suffer if trade agreements collapsed and alliances crumbled over a courtship that some considered a matter of personal indulgence rather than genuine partnership. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of course," Councillor Hale said, "but I would ask that you consider carefully, and quickly. The longer this situation continues unresolved, the more damage accumulates, damage that becomes increasingly difficult to repair." She left the chamber in a daze, walking without any clear destination, through corridors that suddenly felt cold and unwelcoming, despite the warmth of the hearths lining every hall. She did not seek out Barros immediately, uncertain how to even begin explaining what had just transpired, uncertain whether telling him would only add another burden to shoulders already carrying the weight of an entire kingdom. She found herself, eventually, in the garden, though the winter cold had long since stripped away the lush greenery that had once made the space feel alive and welcoming. The bare earth and dormant plants matched the hollow feeling settling into her chest, and she sat on the low garden wall where she and Barros had shared so many mornings together, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold and against the enormity of the decision now facing her. She did not know how long she sat there before Wren found her, drawn, she later learned, by a servant who had overheard rumors of the council's summons and thought Wren deserved to know immediately. "You look like someone who has received very bad news," Wren said, settling beside her on the cold wall without hesitation, despite her fine clothing. Mira told her everything, the accusations about failing trade agreements, the noble families threatening to withdraw support, the offer of money, and a distant estate in exchange for quietly disappearing from Barros's life. Wren listened without interrupting, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the account unfolded. "That is outrageous," Wren said finally, anger sharpening her voice. "The council has no right to summon you without Barros present, no right to pressure you into a decision of this magnitude without his knowledge." "They said it would be easier if it came from me," Mira said quietly. "That I was in a better position to make the sacrifice gracefully." "That is manipulation dressed up as concern for the kingdom," Wren said firmly. "Corwin has wanted his daughter on the throne for years. This has far less to do with genuine political necessity, and far more to do with clearing an obstacle from Isolde's path." "But the trade agreements," Mira said, "the alliances, those consequences are real, even if Lord Corwin's motives are not entirely pure." Wren was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Some of it may be real," she admitted eventually. "Court politics are rarely simple, and I will not pretend that noble families are entirely inventing their concerns. But that does not mean the solution is for you to disappear quietly, sacrificing your own happiness to smooth over political anxieties that Barros, as king, should be the one to address directly. He cannot address every noble family's individual anxiety, Mira said, not without abandoning me anyway. In practice, if not in name. Then let him decide that, Ren said. Let him weigh the political consequences against what he actually wants, rather than allowing the council to pressure you into making that decision on his behalf, without his knowledge, based on threats dressed up as reasonable compensation. Mira absorbed this, feeling the weight of the decision pressing more heavily rather than less. I do not want to be the reason his kingdom suffers, and I do not think you should be forced to carry that burden alone, in secret, while the council congratulates itself on solving a problem without ever having to face my brother's reaction to losing you, Ren said. Talk to him, Mira. Whatever you decide, decide it together. Not because a room full of powerful men decided it was easier to pressure the person with the least power in this situation. Mira nodded slowly, though uncertainty still churned uncomfortably in her chest. She knew Ren was right, that keeping this from Barros would only compound the betrayal the council had already attempted, deciding matters that affected his life without his knowledge or consent. But she also feared, deeply, what his reaction might mean, whether learning of the council's demands might force a confrontation that could not be easily resolved, whether the choice ultimately facing them was as simple as Ren made it sound, or whether the kingdom's stability truly did depend on a sacrifice only Mira seemed positioned to make. She rose from the cold garden wall as the sun began sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the dormant earth, and made her way toward Barros's private study, uncertain of what she would say but certain, at least, that Ren was right about one thing. Whatever happened next, it needed to happen with honesty between them, not through secrets carried alone in the cold winter dark. Barros listened to Mira's account of the council meeting, with a stillness that frightened her more than any outburst could have. His hands clenched on the arms of his chair, his face growing paler with every detail she relayed. They summoned you without my knowledge, he said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. They offered you money to disappear. They pressured you into believing the stability of an entire kingdom rests on your willingness to walk away from me. They believe it does, Mira said, and I am not entirely certain they are wrong. They are wrong, Barros said, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. This kingdom's stability does not depend on which noble family provides my consort. It depends on fair governance, sound policy, and treaties negotiated on their own merits rather than through marriages designed to secure loyalty that should exist regardless. That is a beautiful ideal, Mira said softly. But the trade agreements have already collapsed, Barros. Real families, real merchants, real farmers will feel the consequences of that collapse, whether or not the underlying principle is fair. Barros paced the length of his study, running a hand through his hair, clearly wrestling with the tension between his personal feelings and the practical realities Mira had described. I need to speak with the council myself, directly. I will not allow them to make demands of you behind my back again. He requested an emergency session for the following morning, and Mira, despite her exhaustion and lingering uncertainty, insisted on attending, though several council members visibly bristled at her presence in what they clearly considered a matter best discussed without her. I understand you met with Mira yesterday, Barros said, once the council had assembled, his voice carrying a controlled fury that silenced the room immediately. Without informing me, offering her money to end our courtship, framing it as a sacrifice for the good of the kingdom. Your Majesty, Councillor Hale began carefully. We believed. You believed you could manipulate the person with the least power in this situation into solving a political problem you were unwilling to raise with me directly, Barros interrupted. That is not diplomacy, Councillor. That is cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. A tense silence followed, several council members exchanging uncomfortable glances. Lord Corwin, notably, remained composed, his expression carefully neutral. The concerns raised are legitimate, whatever method was used to raise them, Lord Corwin said evenly. 3 families have withdrawn support for the Southern trade agreements. That is not fabrication, Your Majesty. That is fact, and it demands a response regardless of how uncomfortable the underlying conversation might be. Barros turned to face him directly. Then let us have that conversation honestly, Lord Corwin, rather than through backroom pressure applied to someone with no political standing to resist it. What exactly are you proposing? That your Majesty reconsider the wisdom of publicly pursuing a relationship that carries such significant political cost, Lord Corwin said. Not necessarily end it entirely, if your Majesty is truly attached, but perhaps manage it with greater discretion, while pursuing a formal marriage alliance that satisfies the concerns of families whose support this kingdom cannot afford to lose. You are suggesting I marry someone else while continuing to see Mira in secret, Barrows said flatly, as though she were something to be hidden away, rather than a person deserving of honesty and respect. I am suggesting a pragmatic solution to a genuine political problem, Lord Corwin said, his patience thinning slightly. One that does not require your Majesty to abandon personal happiness entirely, merely to manage it more discreetly than a public courtship allows. Mira, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, felt sick at the casual cruelty embedded in the proposal, the suggestion that she might exist as some secret arrangement, while Barrows married another woman for the sake of political convenience. She glanced at Barrows, and saw her own revulsion, mirrored plainly on his face. I will not insult Mira by treating her as something to hide, Barrows said, his voice hard. And I will not insult whatever unfortunate woman you have in mind for this proposed marriage, by asking her to accept a husband whose genuine affection lies elsewhere. That is not a solution, Lord Corwin. That is cruelty distributed across 3 people instead of concentrated in one. The room fell silent again, and Mira watched Lord Corwin's composed expression finally crack, just slightly, frustration, and something like genuine concern, flickering across his features. Then what do you propose, Your Majesty? He asked. Because the families withdrawing support are not doing so out of petty spite. They are doing so because they no longer trust that Your Majesty's decisions are guided by the kingdom's welfare rather than personal desire, and that lack of trust has consequences that extend far beyond this single relationship. Barrows was quiet for a long moment, and Mira could see him genuinely wrestling with the question, weighing the practical concerns against everything he had already sacrificed to reach this point. Finally he spoke, his voice steadier than before. I propose that I address the Council's concerns directly and transparently, rather than through the manipulation of vulnerable parties, he said. I will meet individually with the families who have withdrawn support, and I will negotiate the trade agreements on their actual merits, offering whatever fair concessions are necessary to secure their cooperation, without requiring a marriage alliance as leverage. If that proves insufficient, we will address the shortfall through other means, but I will not treat Mira as a bargaining chip to be discarded whenever political convenience demands it. Councillor Hale studied him for a long moment. That is a significant undertaking, Your Majesty. Individual negotiations with multiple noble families, each likely demanding different concessions, will require considerable time and diplomatic effort. Then I will invest that time and effort, Barrows said. I would rather work harder to solve this problem honestly than solve it easily, by sacrificing someone who has done nothing to deserve such treatment. The council session ended without full resolution, the assembled members clearly unconvinced that Barrows's proposed approach would succeed, but unable, given his firm stance, to push further in that particular meeting. Mira left the chamber feeling a complicated mixture of gratitude and lingering unease, aware that Barrows had defended her fiercely, but also aware that the underlying political tensions remained entirely unresolved. Thank you, she said, once they were alone in the corridor outside the council chamber, for standing by me in there. I would stand by you in every room in this palace, every single time, Barrows said, though exhaustion had crept into his voice, the strain of the confrontation clearly weighing on him. But I understand this is not truly resolved, Mira. The families withdrawing support have genuine concerns, and I cannot simply order them to trust me through sheer force of will. What if you cannot resolve it? Mira asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been building in her chest throughout the entire meeting. What if, despite everything, the negotiations fail, and the kingdom truly does suffer for this? Barrows was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a heaviness that frightened her more than his earlier anger had. I do not know, he admitted. I want to tell you that everything will work out, that my efforts will succeed, and the council's concerns will prove exaggerated. But I cannot promise that, Mira, and I will not lie to you by pretending otherwise. The honesty, though painful, settled something uncertain in Mira's chest, a confirmation that whatever happened next, they would face it with truth between them, rather than comfortable falsehoods. But the uncertainty itself remained a heavy weight, and over the following weeks, as Barros threw himself into individual negotiations with increasingly frustrated noble families, Mira found herself watching him grow more exhausted, more strained, the easy warmth that had first drawn her to him in the garden gradually eroding under the accumulated pressure of a fight that seemed, with each passing day, increasingly difficult to win. She began to wonder, quietly, painfully, whether Ren's advice to endure, rather than disappear, had been the right counsel after all, or whether some sacrifices, however unfair, might ultimately serve a greater good that outweighed her own happiness. She did not share these doubts with Barros, unwilling to add further weight to shoulders already bent under the strain of negotiations that showed little sign of resolving in their favor. But the doubts lingered, growing heavier with each difficult week, until they finally crystallized into a decision she was not yet ready to voice aloud, even to herself. The letter Mira wrote took 3 attempts before she found words that felt honest, without sounding as though she were fleeing out of cowardice. She wrote it late at night, by the light of a single candle, her hand steady, despite the ache in her chest, and when she finally finished, she read it through twice, before folding it carefully and sealing it with wax. She did not plan to deliver it in person. She had decided, after weeks of watching Barros grow more exhausted and strained under the weight of negotiations that seemed increasingly unlikely to fully satisfy the council's demands, that a quiet departure would spare him the burden of an argument he did not need. One more difficult conversation added to an already impossible list. She would leave the letter with Ren, along with a request that it be delivered only after Mira had already left the palace grounds, far enough away that Barros could not simply follow and undo whatever resolve she had managed to gather. She packed only what she had arrived with 2 years earlier, a single trunk containing worn clothes and a few small keepsakes from her family, unwilling to take anything the palace or Barros had provided that might feel, in retrospect, like payment for services rendered, rather than gifts freely given. She left before dawn, while the palace still slept, moving quietly through corridors she had memorized over months of careful navigation, avoiding the paths most frequented by early rising guards. She reached the garden one final time before departing entirely, unable to resist the pull of the place where everything between them had begun. The winter cold still gripped the grounds, though the first tentative signs of thaw had begun appearing at the edges of the flower beds, small green shoots pushing determinedly through soil that had been frozen solid only weeks earlier. She sat on the low garden wall one last time, remembering the carrots and the pastries, and the easy laughter that had once made this place feel like the only honest corner in an otherwise complicated world. She was still sitting there, lost in memory, when she heard footsteps approaching, hurried and heavy, and looked up to find Ren standing before her, breathing hard, her expression somewhere between fury and desperate relief. "You were supposed to be gone already," Ren said. "The letter said you would leave before anyone woke." "I could not leave without seeing the garden one more time," Mira admitted. "You read the letter?" "I read it the moment you handed it to me last night, despite your instructions," Ren said, not remotely apologetic. "Did you truly believe I would simply let you disappear, without at least trying to stop you?" "I hoped you would respect my decision," Mira said quietly. "I respect that you believe this is the right choice," Ren said. "I do not respect the choice itself, and I certainly do not respect that you intended to make it without giving my brother any opportunity to weigh in." "He has enough weighing on him already," Mira said. "I did not want to add this burden." "You think leaving him a letter after you have already vanished is somehow less of a burden than a difficult conversation?" Ren's voice rose with genuine frustration now. "Mira, he is going to be devastated regardless of how you deliver the news. The only difference your letter makes is that he will also feel betrayed, robbed of any chance to respond, to fight for what you are choosing to sacrifice without his input." The words landed with uncomfortable weight, and Mira felt her carefully constructed resolve beginning to waver. "I thought I was protecting him." "You are protecting yourself from having to face his reaction," Ren said, more gently now, though the correction still stung. "Which is understandable, Mira. Difficult conversations are hard, And watching someone you love hurt because of a choice you are making is harder still. But that does not make quiet disappearance the kinder option. It only makes it the easier one for you. Mira sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing this, the letter's careful words suddenly feeling less like an act of selfless sacrifice and more like exactly what Ren had described, a way of avoiding pain rather than genuinely sparing Barrows from it. Before she could formulate a response, she heard a third set of footsteps, faster and more frantic than Ren's had been, and looked up to see Barrows himself running down the garden path, his coat only half fastened, his hair disheveled, as though he had dressed in desperate haste. Mira. Her name came out of him like something torn loose, relief and fear tangled together, as he stopped before her, chest heaving. Ren sent word the moment she realized you might still be here. I thought. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, his eyes searching her face, as though trying to confirm she was truly real, and truly still present. I am still here, Mira said softly. Why? He asked, and the single word carried an entire winter's worth of accumulated fear and exhaustion. Why would you leave without telling me, without giving me any chance to change your mind, or to understand, or simply to say goodbye properly? Because I did not want you to talk me out of it, Mira admitted, the honesty surprising even herself. Because watching you exhaust yourself trying to fix a problem that might not be fixable has become harder than simply removing myself from the equation entirely. That was not your decision to make alone, Barrows said, and though his voice trembled with barely controlled emotion, there was no anger in it, only raw, unguarded hurt. Mira, this affects both of us. It affects the kingdom, yes, but it affects me most of all, and you were prepared to make that choice without even asking what I actually wanted. I know what you want, Mira said. You want to keep me here regardless of the cost, and I love you for that, truly, but I am not certain the cost is fair to ask of you, or of the people who depend on you to rule wisely rather than selfishly. Loving you is not selfish, Barrows said fiercely, closing the remaining distance between them and taking her hands in his grip almost desperate in its intensity. Mira, listen to me. I have spent this entire winter negotiating with families who wanted assurances I could give, without sacrificing you, and I have made real progress, more than the council initially believed possible. 2 of the 3 families have already returned to the trade agreements, satisfied with the concessions I offered. The third remains difficult, yes, but difficult is not the same as impossible. Mira stared at him, this new information reshaping the picture she had built in her mind over the past difficult weeks. You did not tell me this. Because I did not want to offer false hope before the outcome was certain, Barrows admitted. I wanted to bring you good news once I had truly secured it, rather than promises that might still collapse. I did not realize my silence would leave you believing the situation was more hopeless than it actually was. I thought I was watching everything fall apart around you, Mira said, tears finally breaking free despite her earlier resolve to remain composed. I thought leaving was the only way to actually help, rather than continuing to be the reason you exhausted yourself for nothing. It was never for nothing, Barrows said, reaching up to gently wipe away her tears with a thumb that trembled slightly despite the tenderness of the gesture. Every difficult negotiation, every frustrating meeting, every sleepless night spent working through concessions and compromises, all of it has been worth it, because the alternative was losing you, and I have never once, not for a single moment this entire winter, considered that an acceptable outcome. Mira felt something in her chest finally break open, weeks of accumulated fear and doubt and quiet despair spilling out in a rush of emotion she could no longer contain. I am so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I should have talked to you instead of deciding this alone. You should have, Barrows agreed gently, pulling her into his arms, his embrace warm and solid, and achingly familiar despite the tension of the morning. But I understand why you did not, and I forgive you for it, because I know it came from love, rather than any desire to hurt me. Just promise me, Mira, that whatever difficulties we face going forward, you will trust me enough to face them together, rather than deciding alone that I am better off without you. I promise, Mira said, her voice muffled against his chest, relief and lingering grief, and something like fragile hope, all tangled together in her chest. I promise, Barrows. I am sorry I frightened you. You did frighten me, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. More than anything has frightened me in years. Please do not do that again." They stood together in the garden for a long while after that, the morning sun gradually climbing higher over the palace walls, casting warm light across the thawing earth where new growth was already beginning to push through winter's retreat. Wren, who had remained nearby throughout the exchange, finally cleared her throat gently. "I believe," she said, with the faintest hint of a smile, "that this letter can be safely discarded now." Mira laughed, despite the tears still drying on her cheeks, taking the letter from Wren's outstretched hand and tearing it slowly into pieces, watching the fragments scatter across the garden path, like the last remnants of a fear she no longer needed to carry alone. "Thank you," she said to Wren, "for not letting me leave without a fight." "Someone had to," Wren said, "and honestly, it was far more satisfying watching my brother sprint through the palace in his nightshirt than it would have been simply letting you disappear quietly." Barros glanced down at his half-fastened coat, visible beneath it the plain nightshirt he had clearly not paused to remove in his rush to reach the garden, and let out a startled laugh that broke the last of the morning's heavy tension. "I did not even notice." "I noticed," Wren said dryly. "So did the two guards you nearly knocked over on your way here." Mira found herself laughing too, the sound rising unbidden from somewhere beneath the exhaustion and lingering fear of the past several hours, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something like genuine lightness returning to her chest, a fragile but real hope that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, she would not have to face them through quiet, solitary sacrifice, but together, honestly, with the man who had chased her through the palace in his nightshirt rather than let her go. Spring arrived slowly that year, but when it finally settled over the kingdom, it brought with it a resolution that Mira had once believed impossible during the darkest weeks of winter. The final noble family holding out against the trade agreements, the Ashworth family from the Eastern Territories, eventually agreed to terms after Barros traveled personally to meet with their patriarch, spending 3 days negotiating concessions that satisfied their concerns without requiring any sacrifice on Mira's part. The agreement, once finalized, restored the trade relationships that had briefly seemed at risk, and though several council members remained privately skeptical of Barros's approach, even Councillor Hale grudgingly admitted that the outcome had proven more favorable than anyone, including Barros himself, had initially dared hope. Lord Corwin's opposition softened gradually over the following months, not out of any genuine change of heart, Mira suspected, but out of practical recognition that continued resistance served no purpose once the political concerns his family had raised were substantially addressed. Lady Isolde remained coldly distant whenever their paths crossed, though even her sharp remarks grew less frequent as the court's attention gradually shifted toward other matters, other gossip, other targets for its restless appetite for drama. Mira returned to her work in the garden with renewed purpose that spring, though her days now included far more than simple weeding and planting. Barros had, over the winter's difficult months, begun including her in small ways, in matters beyond the garden walls, seeking her perspective on decisions affecting the kingdom's common people, valuing the practical wisdom she had developed through years of ordinary life that most of his advisors, raised entirely within noble privilege, simply did not possess. It was on a bright morning in early summer, nearly a full year after Mira had first thrown a basket of carrots at his feet, that Barros found her in the garden, kneeling among rows of vegetables that had grown lush and abundant under her careful attention, and asked her to marry him. He did not plan any elaborate ceremony or grand gesture, understanding by now that Mira valued sincerity over spectacle, and instead simply knelt beside her in the dirt, heedless of how it might stain his fine clothes, and asked plainly whether she would consent to become his wife, and, eventually, the kingdom's queen. "You are kneeling in the mud," Mira said, laughing through sudden tears, "in what I am fairly certain is one of your best coats." "I do not care about the coat," Barros said, though a small, self-conscious smile tugged at his mouth. "I care about your answer." "Yes," Mira said, before he could even finish producing the ring he had commissioned, simple and unadorned in a way that suited her far better than anything elaborate would have. "Yes, of course, yes." Their wedding took place in early autumn, timed deliberately to coincide with the kingdom's harvest festival, a choice Barros had insisted upon, wanting their union celebrated alongside the abundance of the season, rather than confined to the formal grandeur of the Great Hall alone. The ceremony itself was smaller than court tradition typically demanded, attended by close friends and family, rather than the full assembly of nobility. Though word of the celebration spread quickly enough that ordinary folk from across the kingdom traveled to the palace grounds to witness the occasion, drawn by the story of a king who had chosen love over political convenience. Ren stood beside Mira throughout the ceremony, radiant with genuine happiness for a woman she had come to consider a true sister, rather than simply her brother's chosen companion. Even a few of the more reasonable noble families, having witnessed over the preceding months that Barros's affection for Mira had strengthened rather than weakened the kingdom's stability, attended with expressions of genuine, if somewhat surprised, warmth. The feast that followed the ceremony carried echoes of that very first garden encounter, deliberately arranged by Barros, who had insisted that carrots feature prominently among the dishes served, much to the bemusement of the palace kitchen staff, who could not quite understand why their king found such simple humor in the request. "You truly could not resist, could you?" Mira said, watching him pile a generous serving onto his plate with the same enthusiasm he had shown that very first morning in the garden. "I have never been able to resist good carrots," he said, grinning at her across the table, the same warm, boyish grin that had first caught her attention before she knew anything about crowns or kingdoms, or the weight of responsibility he carried, or good company. "I seem to remember being told, quite firmly, that I would spoil my appetite by eating too many, all those months ago." "I remember that too," Mira said, laughing. "You did not listen then, and I doubt you will start listening now." "Never," he agreed cheerfully, reaching across the table to take her hand, his expression softening from playful humor into something deeper and more sincere. "I am grateful every single day that you did not know who I was when you threw that basket at my feet, Mira. If you had known, you would have been careful, polite, distant in all the ways court etiquette demands. Instead, you scolded me for my appetite and threatened to send me home, and somehow, impossibly, that became the truest conversation I had experienced in years." "I am grateful too," Mira said softly, "though I do not think I would recommend hitting strangers with vegetables as a general strategy for finding love." "No," Barros agreed, laughing. "Perhaps not a strategy for everyone. But it worked remarkably well for us." As the feast continued late into the evening, filled with music and laughter and the warm glow of torchlight against the gathering darkness, Mira found herself reflecting on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the frightened girl who had once believed herself too clumsy and too ordinary to ever be truly wanted, who had accepted quiet disappointment as simply the shape her life would take. She thought of the anonymous threats and the calculated cruelties, the council's cold demands, and her own moment of near despair in the garden before dawn, ready to disappear rather than continue fighting for something that had seemed, in her darkest hours, impossibly out of reach. And she thought of Barros, chubby and cheerful, and endlessly kind, beneath the weight of a crown he had never asked to carry with such isolation, who had found in her, of all people, a piece of ordinary honesty that no title or performance could replace. He had eaten her carrots not because he needed to impress her, she understood now, but because something in that simple, genuine moment had reminded him what it felt like to be seen as himself, rather than as a role to be played, and that reminder had been worth pursuing, regardless of what obstacles the world placed in their path. Later that night, as the celebration finally wound down and the palace grounds grew quiet beneath a canopy of autumn stars, Barros and Mira walked together through the garden one final time, as an unmarried couple, though the distinction, they both understood, had become largely symbolic, given everything they had already endured and overcome together. "Do you have any regrets?" Barros asked quietly, as they paused beside the low garden wall where their story had truly begun. "About any of it? The difficulty, the cruelty, the winter when you nearly left?" Mira considered the question seriously, unwilling to offer a quick, easy answer to something that deserved genuine reflection. "I regret that I frightened you, that morning I almost left," she said finally. "And I regret every unkind word spoken against either of us, by people who never bothered to understand what we actually shared. But the difficulty itself, the fighting for something worth having, I do not regret that at all. I think, in some strange way, it taught me things about my own strength that I might never have discovered otherwise." "What things?" Barros asked, genuinely curious. "That I am stronger than Clumsy," Mira said, smiling. That belonging somewhere is not about grace or perfection, but about choosing to stay, again and again, even when staying is difficult. That love worth having is rarely easy, but it is always worth the difficulty, if the person beside you is worth it too. And am I worth it? Barros asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. You eat too many carrots, Mira said, laughing. And you once chased me through the palace in your nightshirt in front of 2 very startled guards. So yes, impossibly, entirely, you are worth every bit of difficulty this past year has demanded. Barros pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, the warmth between them settling into something steady and certain after so many months of uncertainty and struggle. Then I suppose, he said softly, we have both found exactly what we did not know we were looking for. In a garden neither of us expected to matter as much as it did. Above them, the autumn stars continued their slow, patient wheel across the darkened sky, indifferent to crowns and councils and the calculated cruelties of court politics, witnessing only 2 people who had fought, against considerable odds, to choose each other honestly, and who now stood together in the quiet garden where it had all begun, ready to face whatever the future held, not as king and gardener, but simply, finally, as 2 people who had found, in each other, exactly the kind of belonging that neither had believed themselves worthy of finding at all.